Hello, this is Tim Congdon, Chair of the Institute of International Monetary Research at the University of Buckingham. It's May 2026. Usually in these videos I look at monetary developments around the world and try and draw conclusions for the world economy. But today I'm going to focus on two topics which are very important at the moment, which do indeed affect the monetary outlook and indeed the macroeconomic position in the next few years, but aren't very specifically about banking and money. I want to talk first of all about what's happening with the Ukraine war, and then secondly I'll be having a look at the confrontation between the United States and Iran. Both of these, of course, are having very major effects on such things as the oil supply, oil prices, inflation, and so on. And so we need to look at them. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, I have been talking about Russia off and on because of its wider economic significance. And my line in these videos has been consistent, that Russia isn't a superpower, and in particular it lacks advanced manufacturing capacity to produce weapons. It's far behind the West in its overall productive capacity, and in that sense this idea that Russia was going to walk all over Ukraine and was misleading. If Ukraine was supported by the West, Russia might have quite a hard time, and that's what's happened. Now let me just reflect on what's been going on over these 4 years. I'm going to focus on how we've dealt with it, but this was something that I put out in September 2022. I looked at numbers for the share of Russia and the West as a share relative to world output measured at current prices and exchange rates. It would be different if it was measured at purchasing power parity, but what matters in terms of weapons, so much of the components are traded, is GDP, current prices, current exchange rates, at least in my view. Now in 2021, just before the invasion, the West, North America, Europe, and so on, accounted for about getting up to 60% of world output. By contrast, Russia accounted for 1.8% of world output. So the disparity was about 32 times. 32 times. Now, even if Russia devotes, say, 15% or 20% of GDP to military expenditure, the West has to devote something like 0.5%, 1% to have the same effect. So if the West supported Ukraine, then Russia might be in trouble. We had this issue in rather stark form at the start of last year, early 2025, when Donald Trump, allegedly wanting to make peace, said that he would withdraw financial support from Ukraine in its contest with Russia. And there was a very widespread expectation that this then meant that Ukraine would collapse. I put out a video, I think it was February, March of last year, where I said, no way, because let's just look at the West without the USA. Let's look at the West, the European Union, the UK, Japan, South Korea, and so on. Let's look at them without the USA and compare them with Russia. And this is what I came up with. And I suggested that, in fact, Russia still had a very serious problem. Now, by this point, the war between Ukraine and Russia was very much about drones. Russia's got a larger army, of course, but Ukraine had, to some extent, coped and got by replacing soldiers with drones. And these become very effective, so-called first-person drones could be launched from a mile or two away, directed at a particular individual, and would be certain that meant the end of that individual. And so the Ukraine was ahead of Russia, even in 2024, in drone technology. Part of the reason here, I'll come on to this shortly, is the way that they're organized in the two countries. At any rate, I suggested early last year that the fact that the Americans were withdrawing financial support did not mean that Ukraine would collapse. Anyway, we get through to summer of 2026, as we are now, and there are reports of increasing difficulties in Russia, and don't come as a great surprise to me, but much of the trouble arises because of what's happening, as far as Russia is concerned, from the developments in drone technology. They're organized differently in Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine has got a number of competing suppliers, privately owned, seeking profit. There's lots of contact between the front line of the Ukrainian military and those suppliers. There's also a great deal of interaction between these Ukrainian companies and military suppliers, defense contractors in other Western countries. And that contrasts totally with the Russian approach, which is to centralize state control, state ownership, and so on. One of the lessons of the 20th century is that state control, state ownership don't work, demonstrated clearly enough by the failure of the Soviet Union in economic competition with the West. And that's what's happened in this particular sector of of military production. Now, the trouble for the Russians here is that the Ukraine and other European countries and so on are actually increasing their drone production at the moment, increasing it faster with better quality drones than Russia is, and Ukraine is then sending these to damage Russia's oil and gas infrastructure, and also its weapons factories and so on. And these are having very major effects. Just an example, there's a refinery, Tuapse refinery, which has been devastated in the last few months, weeks and months, by Ukrainian drones, and produces usually about 3 or 4% of Russian refined oil. And you can see here, this is a chart taken from the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, to whom I say thank you. You can see that its output in recent months has been much lower than in the same months of 2025. In fact, the fall is of the order of 60% or more. Now look, if Ukraine can do that to one oil refinery, it can now send these drones 1,500 kilometers even to the Urals. All of Russia's oil and gas infrastructure is at risk, the whole lot. What does that then mean for Russia's ability to export oil and gas? What does it mean for the government finances? Of course, the pictures of this devastation are rather dramatic, but that's not really the point. The point is the impact on Russia's ability to continue with this war is obviously very serious for Russia. There are wider implications of all this. At the moment, there is a lot of pressure in Britain and elsewhere for more defense spending. For what purpose? The only serious threat to Europe, UK, I suppose North America in some sense, is Russia. Admittedly, there's military competition between America and China, but that's another subject. I put it to you that Russia is not a threat to Europe, UK, or whatever. It is too far behind in the ability to produce advanced manufactured products. It is not a threat to Europe and the UK. If the Ukraine can withstand a Russian attack for 4 years, the rest of Europe doesn't need to worry. This matters for all this talk about raising defense spending to 5% of GDP. That is not necessary. it's nonsense because of the size of Russia on a world map, what I call the cartographic kind of illusion, cartographic hallucination. Russia is not a major threat in conventional warfare to the West. It's as simple as that. And this war demonstrates that. Nuclear is another matter. I'm not going to talk about that. As far as conventional warfare is concerned, we do not have to worry about Russia. Finish. Now, the second thing I want to talk about was the confrontation between the USA and Iran. And obviously, here, usually it's said that Iran has a GDP of perhaps $400 billion, compares with the USA of $30,000 trillion. So there isn't really $30,000 billion, sorry. So there isn't really any contact between these two. It's plain that the USA is far, far ahead of Iran. But there's quite a bit of trouble in the oil market, obviously. One should just say, in qualification here, that before this war, it was expected that the global oil market would be in oversupply. So one of the reasons why oil prices haven't risen more than expected is indeed that is that there was oversupply before, with new suppliers such as Guyana and Brazil coming along. Now, the oil market is characterized by inelastic demand on both the supply side. It's difficult to increase production quickly in the short run, and it's also inelastic on the demand side because we really have got to be able to move our cars around, and main use nowadays is transport. We have to go on holiday and fly in planes. We have to drive our cars around. So the demand is inelastic. That then means that if you get any interruption to supply, the price movement is disproportionate. And what we've got here is, just to sort of give some numbers on all this, that at an oil price of, say, $65, $70 a barrel, the value of world production of oil in, say, in 2025 was a bit under $3 trillion. Natural gas, perhaps about $1.75 trillion. World output estimated by the IMF World Bank at $118 trillion. So oil and gas at those prices accounted for about a bit over 4% of world output. The price has gone up so far by about 50%. So the impact on the price level, this isn't an inflation effect. Inflation is something that just goes on decade after decade. This is a price level effect. The impact on the price level is it's significant, but it's much larger than the output effect. Global output going down 0.5%, 0.75% world output at most. That's because the production of oil in such countries as Kuwait, gas in Qatar, is trapped, can't get out. Iraq as well. Main points I want to make here are first of all that there is supply getting out from these countries in practice anyway. There are pipelines available to Saudi Arabia and the UAE to get oil out that avoid the Straits of Hormuz. And even amazingly, with the opening up of Syria, lorries can take oil out of Iraq and then by extension Kuwait. So I don't think people say that about a fifth of world oil is being blocked by the closure of the Straits of Hormuz. I suspect it's quite a bit less than that, and over time the proportion will fall as these countries find other ways of getting oil out. But the second point I really want to emphasize is that if we look out to, say, a bump. There's an effect on oil prices now. There's an effect on the price level, the inflation rate. This is not a continuing effect. It shouldn't change monetary policy. Large interest rate increases in response to the impact effect on the inflation rate is not the right thing to do. And let's just remember that when we look out to sort of say 2028, 2029, there'll be a fall in oil prices that will probably be similar to the increase that we've had from roughly say 65, 70 to about $100 a barrel. We'll have to be an offsetting fall, and there'll then be an offsetting effect on inflation numbers too, so that when we look out to that period, this is it's an important event, sure, but not something that's going to fundamentally change the world inflation prospect. For that, we need to look at monetary trends. It's another subject. My views there haven't changed in recent months. US money growth has accelerated since spring of 2025 to numbers that are not consistent with 2% inflation. Elsewhere in the industrial world, the money growth is moderate and inflation prospects are fine. There's been a lot of information I've tried to convey today. My main point is actually very reassuring that the Russia-Ukraine war is coming to an end in a way that's very satisfactory to the West, and the Iran problem is only temporary. Thank you.